All right, world cultures. So we're going to take a quick look at the Xia, the Shang, and the Shou dynasty in China. So if you take a look at the time, we're in about 2000 BC, which means civilizations have already risen and fallen for over 1,000 years in Mesopotamia in the Middle East. Egypt is roughly 1,000+ years into their history, and the Indus civilization in India has begun and is functioning. So what we want to take a look at is when China really gets started. So when we see what is called the Xia dynasty, we are still seeing very likely what is Neolithic China. So very limited use of metals, mostly stone tools, similar to the Neolithic stuff we learned in the first quarter of the school year. But you're going to see the Xia dynasty mentioned quite a bit. They are largely a creation of myth, and they are used to teach lessons throughout Chinese history. As you read our initial source documents, the Mandate of Heaven being a key one, you're going to see the importance of family and history throughout the culture of ancient China, and then that will influence Confucianism, which will have a dramatic influence moving forward. In fact, when we read Confucius, who writes right around 500 BC, Confucius is going to mention that none of what he writes is new, but instead he is just kind of recording what has traditionally been believed and thought in China. So we can flip ahead to 1700, 1600, 1500, we see the emergence of our first dynasty that we know existed, and it's the Shang dynasty. Now the Shang are famous for a couple of major ideas. One is bronze working, okay? And because of the access of wood, we see a blast furnace in China, which allowed the melting and casting of bronze using a mold, which is going to actually be kind of important in Chinese history. But at any rate, like anywhere else, we're seeing metalworking. Another issue that arises for the Shang is going to be this area right here, where we see a lot of horseback nomads who will, whenever weather gets bad, ride south. Now, this is not unique to China. This was true over here in the Middle East. If there's a culture to the north of you, it's usually going to be a little bit colder there if we're in the northern hemisphere. And the people that live there are likely going to move south in times of cold. The difference here is in this entire region that I've circled, we're talking about a relatively arid, dry region here. And it's flat, and so we see a lot of decent grasslands for horse grazing. Now, if we can recall back to the first semester, we know every culture kind of ends up having to have these military class based on horsemen. And that's just as true in ancient China. But it's difficult for agrarian cultures to leverage farming for horses, to leverage their resources to do that. That tends to be when we see feudalism come to arise, because I need to have a class of people who fight on horseback, but it's very hard to provide for them because they cannot be our farming class, and those horses are going to eat a substantial amount of food, and that's going to be farmland that I cannot use. And so the cost there is greater than the cost to the nomad that's up here who simply can move from location to location, increasing the number of horseback warriors. So the Shang dynasty needs to find a way to function and to survive and can deal with what we call the Xiongnu right here, these horseback nomads to the north. Now, this problem is true throughout Chinese history, and those groups will vary in name. And the Shang are not super effective at handling this issue, which is actually what leads to the Shou dynasty. In fact, if you look on a quick study through China's history specifically, we'll see every dynasty have to deal with this. And if you've read the Mandate of Heaven, you know that the belief in China is that the morality of the ruler is determining the outcome of our issues. So if there's earthquakes, fires, or invasions by these northern nomads, frequently referenced as the Fang in oracle bones, where people would try to read bones or cracks in tortoise shells to determine the will of ancestors and gods. We find that people are viewing the emperor's actions as successful or unsuccessful based on their morality. So that tie between morality and success of the kingdom is essential for us to understand. So we know at some point the Shou dynasty overthrows the Shang, And at the time that the Shou overthrow the Shang, right here around 800, that's when the Mandate of Heaven seems to be written. We know this because the Shang dynasty did not have a term for heaven, but during the Shou that came to exist. And so the document you read about that justifies Shou rulers and creates that system of the dynastic cycle moving forward. Now, you'll see the Warring States period here. This is when China falls into separated kingdoms for the first time in its history. And we can kind of pull our way over to China here. All right, and we can put them in the middle. We can see that it's several different states that are at war with one another. This is the world that Confucius is born into. Confucius recognizes that China is divided and believes that it's because they've lost their way. And his solution is really to start at the ground. He has a really wonderful quote in which he talks about worrying about the roots or worrying about the tree, right? And if we take care of the roots to the tree, that's a really nice tree. If we care for the roots, then we care for the tree. Likewise, he believes that the central organizing principle of the state needs to start in the family, and that we should view the ruler or emperor like we do the father in the family. And by viewing the emperor like a father figure, he's going to have that filial respect that we should offer. Filial meaning behaving in the way that a son should behave towards a father. There is an amount of filial piety, religious, reverential respect in this culture for the father and for male ancestors. So we also know we are looking yet again at patriarchal society. Okay, women will have reduced roles, and we will see that. Confucius also will talk about the importance of bureaucrats and education, leading to the establishment of a civil service exam, which is coming eventually. What I want to get to today is the origin of China itself. So we see a state here called the Qin on the western coast. The Qin will, by 300, seize a vast amount of territory, and in this century we will see them expand into the rest of China, particularly under a ruler named Qin Shi Huangdi. And I will show you the Terracotta Army, which is a tomb that's built to Qin Shi Huangdi, the first conqueror to unify China. So he is known for brutality, cruelty, and the belief in a system called legalism, which is basically an ends justify the means, very serious system that we will study, very different than Confucianism. And Qin Shi Huangdi is brutal and cruel and is able to conquer, but you'll see that his dynasty lives barely past his death when it's overthrown by the Han. And the Han are going to be the kind of the classical era. Think of it as the Roman Empire of China. And we're going to talk about them in our next session. But we just want to understand the Shang, the Zhou, the Warring States period, which is going to lead to the development of Confucianism and also Taoism and legalism. And then the establishment of our first empire to conquer China, the Qin.